So yeah, our speaker here that I heard about in January and stuff, it's the nonprofit Texas Tree Organization. And they're interested in promoting native trees. And they have a little tree ranch that's called the TXU Energy Urban Tree Farm and Education Center in over in Dallas County, but he lives here in Arlington. So we're happy to have him over here. That Chris Worst is but we all know about native trees. He's talking about another problem. So come on over here and tell us all about it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Chris Worst, and I'm really happy to be here to speak to you guys about something that's a really important topic and something that is really kind of near and dear to my heart. And that's this disease going around killing oak trees called oak wilt. So I don't know if any of you are Star Wars fans, but today is May 4th. May the 4th be with you. So I decided to call this talk Oak Wilt, the Dark Side of the Forest. Yes. So as you'll find out, there is a dark force looming in our streets and in our woods that affects our oak trees. All right. Little bit about me again. My name is Chris Worst. I am the tree farm supervisor and one of the urban forestry coordinators for the Texas Trees Foundation. As my title implies, and as Jim said, we have a small little tree farm on the campus of Dallas College, Richland campus in Dallas, kind of just near the border of Dallas and Richardson, if you know where that is. The tree farm's been there for a little over 20 years now, and that entire time it's actually been sponsored by TXU Energy. So at that site, we grow some of the trees that we plant at our various plantings throughout DFW and beyond. We also do a lot of education and volunteer activities out there as well, including we had a bunch of 7th graders out there about a month ago to learn about trees. It was great. About 100 of them. It was a lot of people, but it worked. So a little bit about the Texas Trees Foundation. How many of you knew we existed before tonight? One of you? All right. So I'm in the right place. So we are a nonprofit headquarters out of Dallas. We have been in existence for just over 40 years now. Our 40th anniversary was this past November, I believe. And we're all about making Texas greener, cleaner, cooler, and overall better for all of us. That's kind of the goal. This is our mission statement up here, but it's important, and they always make me point this out when I do a talk. We're not just about planting trees, right? We have a lot of different programs. We look at data and maps, and we actually create our own maps so we can kind of carefully plan out where we're going to plant the trees so that they have the most impact on the community. Next slide. So how do we do this? Real quick, we have a few different programs that we work with really closely. So we have our urban forest conservation program. That's kind of the overarching urban forestry program. How many of you know what urban forestry is, if I say it? Okay, good. So basically, urban forestry is kind of taking care of all the trees in an urban setting and kind of thinking of them as a forest and how they interact with each other and the environment and people and animals and all that. So we do things, for example, we made a urban forestry master plan for the city of Dallas that was released in 2019. We're working potentially on one with the city of Fort Worth right now, which I can't say too much about because it's not my project. Basically, the idea with these plans is rather than just kind of sporadically planting trees here and there, they're going to have a larger framework from which to be strategic about that. We also came up with a heat map for Dallas to say, all right, this area has a lot of big heat problem, not a lot of trees. We can plant more trees there as opposed to this area over here that has a ton of trees and is relatively cooler compared to the rest of the city.
Excuse me, Mike, is that the right slide?
Nope, two back. Yep. There we go. So that's that program. We also have what we call the Cool Schools program. That's probably one of our neatest programs, at least, in my opinion. Basically, we design a new playground, learning areas for kids, walking trails, and then we plant trees on a school campus. And it ends up being something that kids can use as they go through school and in the future, especially when the trees grow up and get to be nice, big, pretty trees that shade everything. The coolest thing about this program, though, cool schools, is that on after school hours, non-students can go ahead and use them as a city park. So we actually partner with the City of Dallas's Parks and Recreations Department. And anybody from the community, especially if they don't have a park nearby to go to, they can go and utilize these after school hours. So that's a really cool program. Yeah.
Question from Ann Knudsen. Do you take into consideration prairie land?
That is an excellent question and something that I have been talking about with people as well. So not particularly. We have done some native wildflower plantings actually at our tree farm and at some of the schools, but nothing large scale. I think as we go along, hopefully we'll do more of that type of thing, but for the most part, we're more thinking about trees and shade and things like that. Yeah. All right. Another program we have going on is the Southwest Medical District Streetscape and Park Improvement Project. I don't know too much about that, but how many of you are familiar with the Southwest Medical District in Dallas? Yep. So this is something that you're going to be hearing about a lot more in the next few years. Again, I don't know too much about it yet, but basically we're going to kind of totally reimagine that whole area and plant way too many trees and kind of redesign traffic flow and all sorts of things. So that's coming. Be aware of that. We also just started, actually, we haven't technically started it yet, a green workforce program where we're going to take some kind of late high school and early college age kids that are hopefully a little bit more at risk. And we're going to teach them about trees. We're going to teach them about conservation. We're going to teach about landscaping, all that stuff. And the idea is that will help them get careers within the green industry. So we have 4 students that we're going to be working with here starting about a month from today as our pilot project. And then we're going to do 10 to 20 every 3 or 4 months is the idea. So lots of things going on. All right, next slide. All right, so, but the reason we're all wanting me to talk today is to learn about oak wilt. So oak wilt is a disease, as we'll talk about, and there's 4 different major learning objectives we're going to go through today. So we're going to learn what makes an oak tree an oak. And I'm assuming for the most part, if you guys really love plants, you probably know that mostly, but we'll talk about that. We're going to learn about what oak wilt is. We're going to understand how oak wilt kills a tree and how it spreads. And then we're going to learn about different ways that you can protect your trees, prevent the spread of oak wilt, and then possibly treat for oak wilt if it comes to that. Some of the treatment options are things that you can do by yourself, and others are things that you would need a professional and possibly a lot of money to do. So we'll talk about that as well. Next slide. All right, first and foremost, what is an oak tree? So I was going to go on a whole long spiel about how to identify an oak from other species, but I'm just going to, for the sake of time, assume that if you know what an oak tree you're looking at, yeah. So we'll go on from there. So go on. So really broadly, what is an oak tree? It's in the botanical family Fagaceae. So this family also includes oak trees, but also beech trees and chestnuts. So in this part of Texas and Texas in general, we're mostly talking about oak trees, but there actually are some beech trees kind of over in East Texas and some of the rivers. And then Chinese chestnuts every now and again get planted as a food crop. So you can get like chestnuts roasting on an open fire, chestnuts from those. Yeah, they are delicious. Love them. But for the most part today, we're going to be talking about oak trees. So all oaks are in the genus Quercus. So bur oak is, wow, I am drawing a blank right now, but Quercus, whatchamacallit, red oak, Quercus rubra, excuse me. Talking about the social anxiety, there we go. Anyway, genus Quercus, that's the important part. In Texas, we have 50 native species of oak trees, and that's actually 18% of the total number of native tree species in the state. That's a lot of trees, a lot of species. And if you think about how many of our forests and our street trees are just oak trees in general, it's even more than that. So, I mean, I've been to this botanic garden probably 20 times since I moved down here, and I know there's oaks everywhere throughout here of all different kinds of oaks. Walk down the street, just a little bit north of here or anywhere direction, oaks everywhere, Dallas, oaks, 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 oaks. So you're probably never more than 1,000 feet away from an oak down here, I would think. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but there's a lot of oaks. That's the important part. Some common oak species that we have down here, we have bur oak. This tree right here in the background, this is actually from my family's farm in Michigan. This is a bur oak. Near as we can tell, it's at least 250 years old, and it covers at least an acre of land. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. So these are huge trees, love them. We also have Shumard oaks, which are a type of red oak that get really, really large and broad spreading also. I'm sure you're all familiar with live oaks, have really broad spreading branches. They plant them probably, in my opinion, too much down here for reasons we'll talk about. Post oak. Post oak is another really big tree. Doesn't necessarily get quite as widespread some of the time as some of your live oaks, for example. Tend to be a lot more common in rural areas and in areas that have been developed more recently. So a lot of the residual post oak stands that you see around houses and whatnot, probably that was because they put the house there relatively recently and the post oak trees were already there. So one of the problems we're running into with post oaks is it's really hard to grow them in a nursery and replant them. So especially in urban areas like the DFW Metroplex, we're seeing a decline in those over time, which is unfortunate. And then chinkapin is another species of white oak that we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's just a smattering example of all the oaks we have down here. Great. Next slide. So I'm going to just, again, assume that you more or less all know what oak trees look like, have acorns and whatnot. The big important difference for our discussion is to differentiate between white oak group trees and red oak group trees. So there are individual species of trees called red oaks and there are individual species called white oaks, but both of those would fit into this larger group of white oak group and red oak group. And this is an important distinction because oak wilt, this disease that kills oak trees, mostly impacts red oak group trees. It can impact white oak group trees, but these tend to be more resistant to them than our red oaks, okay? So how do we differentiate between the two? The easiest way to do this is through the leaves. So if you look over here, this chinkapin oak, you see how it's got kind of a wavy leaf margin, no spikes on the end of it. That means it's a white oak tree, okay? So no spikes, as opposed to this red oak on the right. It's kind of a bad picture. I'll show you a better one in a second, but you can see that the leaf margins are pointed at the ends and they've got these spikes that come off of them. So go ahead to the next slide. So this is an example of a Shumard oak leaf, and you can very clearly see what I'm talking about. They've got pointed leaf margins and then these little spikes that come off of them. So if you see that, that's going to be a red oak group tree. Might not be called a red oak, could be a Shumard oak, could be a Texas red oak, could be lots of different oaks. If you see those points, it's going to be a red oak group tree. Okay, all right, next slide. This is another example. This is a blackjack oak tree. Tend to find them a lot around here, more in undisturbed areas. Every now and then there's a park in Arlington. Actually, that's where this one's from, is one of the parks in Arlington. You can see, even if we knew nothing else about this tree, it's got a completely different leaf shape from that Shumard we just talked about, but it's got these pointy leaf margins right here. So we know it's in the red oak group. Next slide. And again, looking back at this chinkapin oak, doesn't have any of those points at the end. So it's in the white oak group. Okay, that's, everybody get that? Okay, any questions about that? All right, hopefully I've beaten that over like a dead horse. So next slide. Anybody know what kind of tree this is?
Live oak.
Live oak, you got it. All right. Live oak's kind of a funny case. So if you notice, this is from a younger live oak tree, and it's got those kind of points like a red oak. Go to the next slide. This is from a slightly older red oak tree, and you see it's kind of rounded off. It doesn't really have those spikes anymore. Live oak, yep. So depending on who you talk to, live oak is either its own group, in the red oak group, or sometimes people say it's in the white oak group, and that's because it acts kind of funky. Great stuff, gotta love it. For our purposes, we're gonna call it red oak group, and most people count it as the red oak group, okay? Fun stuff, and there's a lot of different kind of biological reasons why they can't quite pin down quite what it is, depending on who you talk to, but again, for our purposes, it's also highly affected by oak wilt. We're gonna count it as red oak. Next slide. So talked about a little about oak trees, red oak group versus white oak group. Next, we're going to talk about what oak wilt is. And again, which group gets mostly impacted by oak wilt? Red, exactly. That's the important part. Next slide. So oak wilt is a disease caused by a fungal pathogen called Brachyella fagacearum. Ugh. Mouthful. But if you notice, fagacearum, what did we say that the family name for oaks and all of them was Fagaceae. So you got the family name right in that name. And what does it do? It kills oak trees. That's why we care about it, right? And sometimes it kills them pretty quickly. We'll talk about that in a second. Nobody's quite sure where it came from. I've talked to a lot of different people who have a lot of different ideas. I've read some of the journal articles. They think possibly it came from South Central America, but they're still not quite sure. Nobody knows yet. It's kind of a mystery. What's an invasive species? Anybody want to give me a definition? Anybody? Oh, good. We'll talk about this. So what's that? Depends on who you ask. So the definition I usually give is it's any species that's not native and it can cause harm to people, the environment, or the economy. So by that definition, in order for it to count as an invasive species, it would have had to have come from somewhere else, right? By that definition, if it came from outside of Texas or anywhere in the United States, it would be an invasive species. But if it's just we'd never discovered it before then, it would count as a native species. Who knows? That's open to discussion. We don't know yet. How does it spread? One of the main ways it spreads to new trees is actually by a little tiny beetle called nididulid. So we'll talk about how it does that in a little bit. The other way that it spreads to new trees is by root grafting. So if any of you are familiar with root grafting, or I guess plant grafting in general, basically the oak trees underground will connect their roots together. And the reason they do this is to share water, nutrients, all that good stuff, especially in times of drought or other problems. Unfortunately, in this instance, those root grafts create a pathway for this fungus to travel from tree to tree. So as we'll look at in a little bit, sometimes you have situations where a single tree gets infected and it just spreads to the whole stand of oak trees. It's a problem. And as I said over and over again, red oak trees are the most susceptible to this disease. All right, we'll move on to the next one. So where is oak wilt right now? The newest good map I could find of this was from 2017. It's going to be pretty much the same as it is now. There are probably a few counties that are different, but this gives you a very clear idea that it spread pretty much all through the upper Midwest into the Appalachian Mountains a little bit, West Virginia, Kentucky, and look at this down here in Texas. We got this nice huge block right down here. They first discovered oak wilt in the 1930s in Wisconsin. So I don't know if I said this, I'm from Michigan originally. Speaking from personal experience, we've got a ton of oak forests up in there. Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, that whole area has a ton of oak forests, which explains probably why it's spread so far in those areas, because there's a lot of oak trees. Maybe not so many right down in this area, probably definitely not once you get towards the desert areas. You look at Texas, go on to the next slide. Whoops, one back. There we go. Again, we have a lot of, especially down closer to Austin, we have a lot of live oaks, post oaks, all sorts of things like that that can be susceptible to oak wilt. So it also has a pretty wide range in Texas. First place oak wilt was discovered in Texas was in the 1960s, right here in Dallas. Great stuff. And from there, you can tell it's in both Dallas and Tarrant County where we are right now. Next slide. Back. Feedback. I think we went 3 back. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay. All right, I think we're here now. Okay, perfect. No, that's how it works. Computers, especially Macs. I'm not an Apple person. I'm not gonna lie.
We have a question.
Yes.
It seems like, so that map reminds me of the map for white nose syndrome with bats.
The people that
They
don't
seem
can't hear
to
you talk,
kind of change how it's.
they can't hear you.
Yeah. So go ahead and.
I'm just wondering, change was seen it spread further.
Climate change. So the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is, the map kind of reminds you of white nose syndrome on bats. Does climate change have anything to do with this?
Climate change affected
Yep.
how white nose syndrome.
Yep.
was able to change.
Answer to that question is maybe, who knows?
Okay.
The problem again is that we still don't even know where this came from. This could have been kind of always a thing. Maybe it's, I kind of doubt that there's more of it showing up now because of climate change, but it's possible. I would think it's more likely to be more widespread and be more of a problem because of people in general, for reasons we can talk about in a minute. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It could be climate change, absolutely, but I would first point my finger to some other factors. All right, so oak wilt, how does it spread? Next slide. So this is really pretty simple. The main two ways the oak wilt spreads are through beetles or roots. So next slide. How it spreads through beetles are through these cute little buggers right here called nididulid beetles. This is actually an entire family of beetles. So if any of you are familiar with emerald ash borer, some of these other insects, it's a single species. It's actually an entire family of insects that can spread oak wilt. So you got two different examples. There's one on the left, it's not as pretty, and you have this really, really pretty bright colored one on the right. All of them are nididulids of different species. They're really, really, really tiny though. If you look inside this cup, every single little dot, that's a nididulid beetle. Really tiny beetle. They're sometimes called sap feeding beetles or picnic beetles because they're attracted to sweet things. So people would find them kind of crawling on their blankets or on their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, apples, whatever they happen to have while they're having picnics. That's why they call them picnic beetles. They are also 100% native. These guys are just doing what they do. Naturally, they would be here. It just so happens that they also happen to spread this terrible disease called oak wilt. Next slide. So how do they do this? So each one of those nididulid beetles, as I said, are attracted to sweet smelling things. If you look underneath the bark of an infected oak tree that has oak wilt, usually you might see this, what we call a pressure pad or a fungal mat. So this is kind of like the oak wilt fungus's mushrooms, right? This is where its reproductive parts are. What happens is that these beetles get attracted to a sweet smell that these pressure pads give off. So if you ever smell it, some people describe it kind of like rancid peanut butter, or some people like, what do you call them? Fruit Loops. Some people like the smell, some don't, but they give off a sweet smell that attracts these beetles. I'll go to the next page. And the beetles will get on these, one back. The beetles will get on these pressure pads. They'll start feeding, doing their thing. And meanwhile, all the spores from the fungus is getting all over this beetle here, okay? So it ends up becoming a vector for the disease because of that. But the question then is, how does that beetle infect a healthy tree, right? So this already had oak wilt. Go to the next slide. So this is our lovely nursery assistant, Eddie. He works for us, he's a great guy. And let's say he went through our woods and he wanted to prune up some oak trees, right? He made some really, really pretty, nice circular cuts, looks great. Say he did it this time of year, right? That's going to open up a wound for those beetles to infect a tree with the oak wilt. So go to the next one. So that's exactly what this picture shows right here. So any wounded oak tree is also going to give off kind of a sweet smell. If you've ever pruned an oak tree, lots of trees do this, but oak trees in particular have kind of a sweet smell they give off. The beetles get attracted to that. The other name was sap feeding beetles, right? So they go, they try to feed on the sap, and then the spores that they had on them get off onto the fresh wound and get into the tree. And thus you have a new tree infected. Go to the next slide. So this is kind of showing what happened after the fact, after a tree got infected. So the fungus will start blocking up the xylem in the tree, which is what allows water to move up and down the tree, right? So that it almost like plugs it up like a cork. So you're almost, what do you want to call it? Not drowning. Oh my God, words are not coming to me. The tree can't get water. That's the important thing. Next page. So that's the main way that new stands of trees get infected with oak wilts. Let's say you have a tree that's fully infected, okay, but none of the trees around it infected. That's when we're going to start talking about root grafts. So this is a really cool slide of what those root grafts can look like. All these could be coming from different trees, but they fuse together, which again, under normal circumstances, that's a good thing for the tree because they're going to be able to share nutrients, resources, water during hard times. But it creates a pathway for that fungus to go from one tree right to another. Next slide. So this is an example of an oak wilt outbreak. Not the greatest slide, but you can kind of see what I'm looking at, these dead trees right here. This was somewhere in West Texas. Most likely what happened is one of these trees got infected with oak wilt. Maybe the rancher pruned one of them, Nidadulid flew around, got on it, infected the tree, and then it spread to all these other trees throughout here, right? So you can see just one tree getting infected can infect an entire stand. So that's kind of a bad thing, right? I will say a lot of times in Dallas County, in Tarrant County, where a lot of our oak trees were not necessarily always there, but were planted by people like me later on. It's not always the case that you're going to have a situation like this, just because the roots might not be grafted, but they could be. It just depends on the situation. Especially down in Austin, I know they get this problem quite a lot. You'll have a neighborhood and, you know, the whole neighborhood can lose its trees because somebody long time ago decided to plant nothing but oak trees, or that's just what was there when they built the houses, and then all their oak trees die. Yes.
Question. Can you stop the spread by trenching around the infected tree?
You've got it, and we will talk about that in a minute. Yep, you are way ahead of me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about that, how you can prevent oak wilt. All right, next slide. So, like with any disease, COVID, right? The best way to treat the disease is to prevent you from getting the disease to begin with, right? So in this case, that could be anything from not cutting trees in the wrong time of year, not pruning your oak trees in the wrong time of year. If you have an area where you know oak wilt either is currently or has been in the past, plant something else. If it's not an oak, can't get oak wilt. Maybe we'll talk about that at the end too. For the most part, if it's not an oak, can't get oak wilt. Otherwise, if you get to the point where you have infected trees, this tree is not infected. This is just a nice live oak outside my apartment. You can go into root trenching like you were talking about, or tree injections. So go on to the next page. So prevention. Here's Eddie again. Let's say it's this time of year. It's a nice day out, May 4th. He wants to go out, prune up these trees, make them look nice and pretty, whatever his reason for pruning the oak tree might be. What's the best possible thing he could do to make sure that these oak trees don't get infected by oak wilt? Yes.
Treat is saw blade.
Treat the saw blade. That's a good one. Any other ideas? Prune at the proper time of year. You got it. So next slide. He can just not do that. That's really the simplest answer. Okay. So if you go to the next slide, Texas A&M Forest Service, all the foresters you're going to talk to will recommend not pruning any oak trees from February 1st through June 30th. It's May 4th. So we got another 2 months of this. Do not prune any of your oak trees. Anybody know why? Any guesses? Yes.
Because the sap is not flowing.
Not because the sap's not flowing.
No, the bugs are more active.
Bugs are more active. Exactly. Yep, you got it. So this is the time of the year when the bugs are most likely to be active. Now, this is kind of I don't want to say a guess. It's kind of our best guess of when in an average year, these bugs are going to be the most active. If we have a really warm spring, it was pretty warm in January, then it cooled down. Those bugs could be flying even earlier than this. If it stays kind of nice and cool, like it kind of has been for now, it could potentially even be later than June 30th. The farther north you go, again, I'm originally from Michigan, the dates turn to March through July. So the farther north you go, this date changes. So if any of you have property up north or know people up north, you know, have them check in their individual state what this time period is, because it's going to change depending on which latitude we're at. Down here in Texas, this is your window of when we don't want to cut any oak trees. Yes.
Range weather question.
We have a house in southern Illinois,
Mhm.
which is quite a bit north.
Yeah.
But because it's on the Mississippi, the weather there is not real different than here.
Mhm.
Does that make a difference, or is it strictly latitude?
So the question was whether or not the weather patterns up north might make a difference as far as this window that we're talking about. My answer to that would be no, not really. It has more to do, I don't know how much you guys know about insects, but they have what's called degree days, which depending on the temperature, they kind of build them up, and it's part of their life cycle, right? So they need so many warm days before they can be flying around and doing this part of their life cycle. So it depends more on how many of those warmer days they have more than it does the weather patterns themselves. Does that make sense? So again, yeah,
And I can't say that that's for sure that's the case, but we've had it out for 4 years. And it hardly ever gets really cold there.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I, you know, and again, it could be you have a microclimate that just happens to be warmer than the surrounding area. In that case, yeah, yeah, exactly. And again, this is kind of just the scientists' best guess of when they're going to be most active. Individual areas, individual, you know, I mean, this is for all the state of Texas, right? Texas is huge. So it could be further south, they start a little bit later than they do up here in North Texas. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors that could affect the actual flying times of these insects, but this is kind of just our best guess. Makes sense. Any other questions on that? Yeah.
Possible to spray some things on that open wound.
So we'll talk about that too. Yeah, that's coming up next. Yep. So this is the most important. So do not prune oak trees from February 1st through June 30th. If you walk away with nothing else tonight, walk away with this. Next slide. Literally the next slide. Yes. So let's say, for example, so we had that date, right? There are a couple exceptions to that. Let's say you have a very dangerous limb that you know is going to fall down on somebody or a car or something like that. In that instance, yeah, you're going to want to go ahead and take the limb down. If you do that, though, you want to go ahead and paint that wound that you made. So they make arborist paint, but literally just a latex paint from Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that. That's good enough to really significantly decrease the likelihood that those beetles are going to get on the wound and pass the fungus onto the tree. So you can see that's exactly what they did here. They cut the tree, they painted it immediately. And what that does is it basically just prevents a barrier that the fungus can't get past and can't get into the tree. So this is really a good thing to do any time of the year on oaks. Personally, if you can really avoid it, which sometimes you can't, I probably wouldn't prune your oak trees until October, November, and then through the winter is the best time to do it. But that being said, regardless of the time of year, it's really good practice to go ahead and paint those wounds. I'm guilty of not doing that. A lot of people don't do that. And it's interesting because, yeah.
The other side of the pill, that's still controversial about that, about whether that's effective or not.
Yes, so yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. So for the most part now, we actually don't recommend painting wounds with tree paint. This is the exception to that. And the reason that they don't recommend it is because we think that it can slow down the way that the tree heals itself, which is basically by growing over that wound. This is the exception though, because oak wilt is such a danger and such a potential problem that we want to make sure as much as we can that it's not going to get infected. The tree can't heal, that doesn't matter if it's dead, right? So that is the exception. Yep. Any other questions on that? Next slide. All right, next thing you can do is to clean your equipment, like I believe you brought up earlier. Yep. So again, I'm kind of guilty of not doing this as much as I should too. But if you are pruning an oak tree, it's a good idea to just go ahead, take some rubbing alcohol, wipe off your pruning shears before you go on to the next tree. That's what this is supposed to be doing. I'll admit it's just water for, you know, the sake of example, but you know, idea is take some rubbing alcohol, go ahead and try to clean off that, clean off those blades. That's not going to completely sanitize the tree. It's just not, but it's going to severely reduce the risk of you spreading the disease to a new tree. Next slide. Other thing you can do don't move firewood. Bad idea to move firewood. Ideally, if you're gonna go camping or something, try to get wood as much as possible from the area you're camping in or living wherever you happen to be. Or sometimes they'll sell kiln dried treated wood from gas stations or Home Depot, Lowe's, all sorts of things like that. Do that. What you don't want to do is get, for example, in this, I think this was in Ohio. I think it was Ohio. Oak wilt site, maybe it's got fungal mat on some of the wood. Maybe there's a nididula beetle in that wood that's infected. You bring it somewhere else, all of a sudden you've introduced oak wilt to a new site potentially. That's also important for any other invasive species. I know you and I were talking earlier about emerald ash borer. They think that was one of the biggest ways that emerald ash borer spread to new sites was by people taking firewood from one county that had it to another county, and then it just kept on going from there. So generally speaking, don't move firewood. Bad idea. Next slide. Another thing you can do, this was from a tree planting that we did, I believe about 1.5 years ago in Dallas. As far as we knew, there were no oak wilt, there were no oak trees affected by oak wilt within the general area. But again, we talked about both Tarrant County and Dallas County have oak wilt. We know this. That doesn't mean we can't plant any oak trees. That just means we need to be careful about it. So one of the things you could do is just to plant a lot of different types of trees, right? More diversity is usually better than a monoculture when it comes to trees or any plants in general. If oak wilt comes here and kills all our oak trees, we're going to have some elms, some maples, other things that are still going to be there, provide shade, stuff for the birds, squirrels, all sorts of things. So diversity is really important. So right plant, right place, right? I'm sure you all know that slogan by heart. I'm talking to that group. So right plant, right place, but also diversity is important. Next slide. So the other thing that we can do if we have a whole stand of trees that's impacted is trenching, like you brought up. So basically what we do in this case is we want to go ahead and make a circle around all the potentially and all the infected trees and potentially infected trees. And the way we do that in Texas, go to the next slide, is by these big honking saws like this. They're awesome. I have never had the pleasure of seeing one in action, but I really want to. And I'm going to do a training myself on oak wilt in a couple of weeks, and I'm hoping we get to see one of these. Really cool. But literally, you have this big honking saw. It goes all the way through the ground. It goes through the roots. It goes through the dirt. It goes through the rocks. And literally, you go 4.5 feet deep all the way around your affected stand of oak trees. Now, the rule is that you go 100 feet past the last tree that appears to have symptoms of oak wilt. That means you could end up sacrificing a few trees that may not have it, right? But the idea is you want to get past where those infected trees are so that the roots can't keep spreading it to new trees. We don't necessarily know that a tree is infected for a little bit. I think we might have missed this slide, but oak wilt can kill a tree in 2 weeks. I mean, it's like somebody snapped a finger. It's really quick. Sometimes it takes longer. I know that there's a few trees at A&M that I saw about a month ago. They've had oak wilt for like 7 years and they're not dead yet, which is kind of weird to me, but it can happen. However, it can also be literally 2 weeks and the tree's dead. So we want to make sure that we completely encircle that stand of trees so that that disease cannot spread. Next slide. So this diagram again is just kind of showing that we've made a nice big trench between our infected trees and our non-infected trees. And again, you won't necessarily have a pretty diagram showing you which roots are infected and which aren't. So we want to go 100 feet past the last infected tree. So this is probably compressed a little bit too much. We'd want to go probably past this tree. And unfortunately, that tree would be sacrificed as well. Any questions about that? Perfect. All right, next slide. The other thing you can do in some instances are stem injections with a fungicide, a systemic fungicide. And basically what they'll do is they'll drill holes right above the roots of the tree. And they'll basically pump a fungicide into the tree. It'll get spread throughout the tree so that if the tree gets infected in the future, hopefully it'll kill that fungus. Now, the problem with this is it's expensive for one. Two, you kind of have to keep doing it every few years. So it's not like it's a one and done situation. So you really only want to do this if you live in an area that has a high risk of oak wilt and you're really, really paranoid about it. I know at A&M, they had a few trees that they've been treating. What is it? Again, I'm not from Texas. It's the century oak, I think, something like that at A&M. So I know that they treated that because they're absolutely paranoid about that one getting oak wilt because there is oak wilt on campus. That would definitely be a situation where you want to take this preventative measure. But again, it can be really expensive. Texas A&M Forest Service does have some cost share options if you have oak wilt. Yes.
How bad is it in the DFW area?
So I haven't seen too much of an issue personally myself. And again, part of that we think is because a good chunk of the oaks here were planted as opposed to kind of being naturally there, especially when it comes to the red oaks, which are most susceptible. So they probably just don't have quite the root grafts built up, but it is potentially a problem. Yeah, for sure. And it is here. Let's put it that way. It is here. It does happen. But do I see oak wilt every time I drive down the street? No. Yeah.
Reporting if you see it.
Yes. So if you do see it, you can report it to the Texas A&M Forest Service. And we have some contact information for them at the end of this presentation. Any other questions? All right, next slide. I'm bringing this up again because this is really the most important takeaway point of this talk. Do not prune trees from February 1st through June 30th if they're an oak tree. Just don't do it. Drill this into your head. Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah.
I've just sent that information to my husband and he said, what about deadwood?
Deadwood is perfectly fine to cut. My only concern is sometimes it's a little hard to tell what is dead on a tree, what's dying. So if you have a branch that's very clearly dead, been dead for a long time, you can prune that any time of year. It's not an issue. But if you, while you're cutting that dead wood, happen to damage a living part of the tree, you're opening up a potential wound for the infection to happen. So if you've got a tree that's completely dead, go ahead and cut it down. It doesn't matter what time of year that is. Yep. So don't worry about that. And again, like I said, the other exception is if it's a dangerous limb, you're going to want to go ahead and do it anyway. I'm not saying, let people die. That's not what I'm saying. Right. So the tree is not as important as the people, but all right. So any questions on that? Any of that? All right. We're going to do a little summary real quick. So oak wilt is oh yeah, I'm sorry.
I had a question.
Sure.
So in the urban areas, we tend to move in and then plant our trees afterwards.
Yep.
So the trees are spread out a little more than the typical oak forest.
Yeah.
Do you see less oak wilt spreading from tree to tree in that scenario? Or do those roots really travel a long way?
Yep. So the question was whether or not in an urban environment, you end up seeing less oak wilt spreading by the roots because of how they've been planted more spread out, right? Yeah. So the answer to that is yes. For the most part, that is true. If you have a bunch of trees that were planted right next to each other, they've been growing there for a long, long time. Yeah, you can end up having that more clustered effect. But if you have more scattered trees, that's going to be more of the individual cases. How do I want to say this? Short answer, yes. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
have a question on the chat.
Oh, sure.
Does burning infected wood stop the spread or does smoke carry the spores?
Smoke does not carry the spores. Yep. So if you have any infected wood, just go ahead and burn it. That's something you can do.
Okay, and where do the beetles go when they're not active?
That's a good question. And I honestly don't know. Yeah, sorry. The question was, where do the beetles go when they're not active? And I, quite frankly, do not quite know everything about their life cycle. I know that's all I'll say about these particular beetles. Yeah. So sorry, I can't answer that one.
Just one
Yep.
more. But can the sap beetles fly to infect trees despite trenching?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's a great point. Yep. So the question was, can the picnic beetles move the disease to a new area despite trenching? Absolutely. So we have that example of where we trenched off a whole circular area of oaks. We've severed the root connections. But let's say, you know, somebody then again goes and prunes the tree right next door during the wrong time. That opens up a wound. A picnic beetle that's in the infected area could easily take it to that new tree. So yes, you could easily break quarantine that way. That's a very good question. Yep. Any other questions? I know you. Go ahead. Oh, you're good.
So I live on a half-acre electric easement, it's just converted to state grid. Encore came through, and removed or trimmed all the trees within 100 feet of their lines, and they trimmed them within that time frame. We actually have a tree near us, looks like it has oak wilt, but I was just wondering, are these entities held to guidelines by federal or state guidelines on trimming these trees?
So the question was tree trimming by utility companies and whether or not they take any precautions or whether or not they're held responsible if they make a wound and oak wilt happens. If they're really, so let's put it this way, for the most part, the power companies, their responsibility are their lines, that's what they're most worried about. If they really know what they're doing, they'll stick to this window. They actually do have foresters on staff, some of these companies. Yep. So he hopefully, or she should have known what they were looking at, hopefully. I highly doubt they did this, but sometimes they'll go through and they'll paint the wounds while they're doing it. This was actually they cut the tree in half. Wait, right in half? Oh, that's terrible. So yeah, they cut the tree right in half. All right. So in that case, yeah, some of these people just genuinely do not know what they're doing, quite frankly. Can anybody hold them responsible for that? Probably not. As far as I know, there's no federal law saying that you have to do that. Yeah.
They were on files with this line that they were installing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they took out all of.
So that date that we showed you earlier, that's a guideline, right? That's not something that's enforceable by law. As far as I know, there could be a state somewhere that does that, but I'm sure it's not Texas, and it definitely wasn't Michigan either. That's definitely more of a guideline for people to follow. But if the company doesn't do it, might be able to nail them for something else, but you're probably not gonna. That's just gonna be the way it is. That being said, you raise a good point I wanted to bring up that I forgot about, and it goes back to planting the right tree in the right place. So many times, I can't tell you how many times I've seen what should have ended up being big, huge oak trees planted right underneath power lines that are maybe 15, 20 feet tall at most. What's the easiest thing we could have done? Just never planted those trees there to begin with. Plant something else like a redbud or something small. It's going to be nice and small. So that's a really good point. I doubt in your case, it sounds like they were probably going way past the power lines. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes there's nothing you can do to avoid that. But, that being said, think in advance. If you are going to plant new trees, don't plant something that's going to get really tall right next to a power line or under a power line. Yeah.
Does the oak wilt affect the acorns and thereby affecting saplings possibly coming up if they could ever make it to the privet?
No.
Teach those bugs to like a privet instead of.
Okay. So the questions where we'll do the best one first, which was, can we train the bugs to go after a privet instead? Unfortunately, no, we can't do that. No, they're more of a generalist. So if privet gets some sort of wound, they might go after it too. But again, oak wilt really only affects oak trees. I wish it could affect privet. We could solve so many problems that way, but we can't. The other question, I'm sorry, repeat the other question.
The question was, does it affect the acorns?
Yeah.
It would go into the saplings as well.
Yep. So the question was, does oak wilt affect the acorns? Basically, is it an STD of trees? No, it does not. The tree will probably I don't want to say that. A lot of times the tree could be dead before it even got to the point where it was producing acorns after it's infected. But no, as far as I know, there's no evidence saying that that the fungus will get into the acorn and affect the tree in any way like that. No.
Another question, do you know of an area in Tarrant County that has a large quantity of the trees that are affected by this? I go to Fort Nature Center, River Legacy an awful lot. And I noticed a lot of damage done to the ash trees, the hackberry trees, but to date, I haven't noticed a lot of oak trees. I will start looking for it now.
Yeah.
But I haven't noticed that.
Yeah, I don't know of any specific areas in Tarrant County that have big pockets of oak wilt. I'm sure they're there, but I don't know any off the top of my head. Yes.
I just have a comment. I have a friend who lives in Cleburne in a house built in the 1950s.
Mhm.
On the whole street, they came down and they pruned it a long time.
Yeah.
The whole street lost their 60-year-old, 60, 70-year-old oaks.
Yeah.
And there's a few that are not even, they were all spaced out, but I guess they were there long enough where they spread it, and I don't know if it was the city or somebody else, but this friend said, yeah, she looked out her window one day and they were on top of a garbage truck. And she said it was in March or something.
Yep. No, they do that. Yeah. The comment was, yeah, the comment was that they had a whole line of trees along, old trees, right? You said at least 60 plus years old. Yeah. And all probably got oak wilt, it sounds like. Could have been something else, but if they were all oak trees, it was the wrong time of year, then yeah, it was probably oak wilt. Do you know if it did start from one tree and spread to the rest of them, or was it kind of all at once?
She thought, she's sort of an ethics too. She thought they had infected equipment.
Yeah, that's true. Yep, they could easily have infected equipment. Yep.
Several.
So that's a good point too. So when it comes to infected equipment, oak wilt isn't the only potential issue from that. There's a lot of like apple diseases and things that can be spread from infected equipment. So it's a good idea to clean them regardless of what kind of species you're pruning. Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm sure it can. And there was a lot of mulch around the bottom of that tree. Breaking some of that mulch might have been from infected trees.
Oh, good question.
That mulch didn't infect that tree.
Yeah, so the question was about mulch and whether or not mulch could infect the tree. I have never heard any research about mulch impacting the tree. So again, in order for it to be mulch, in order for it to really get from an infected tree, those beetles have to be present. And normally when you mulch up wood that kills some of the beetles, not always, a lot of times it does. I'm going to say it's possible, maybe, but I've never heard anybody say that that's a main way that it spreads or that that's even a way that it spreads. I'm talking more about untreated wood, whole portions of logs that you kill for firewood rather than necessarily mulch. And we can talk about that with emerald ash borer too later if you'd like, because that's another fun story. But
the emerald ash borer, the ones that I've noticed out of the Fort Nature Center, and almost all the ash trees have been infected by it.
Yeah.
And the way I knew it was the emerald ash borer was you see when the bark peels away from the tree, you can follow the tracks, the critter that's in there. Well, the emerald ash borer goes horizontal.
Yeah.
The others go up and down and around in all different directions.
So do any of you know what
ash tree, you'll see them all horizontal.
Do any of you know what emerald ash borer is?
Yes.
Okay. Have you had a talk on that yet or anything? Okay, good. That's really, really important too. We can answer some questions about that later on if you'd like at the end here. But that's another really. Yeah, they're huge compared to these. They're giants. Definitely. Yep. Any other? Yeah, go ahead.
Say that I did plant small trees under the power lines.
Perfect.
A long time ago. However, they keep adding power lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was 3 power lines when we started. Now there's 6. It's become lower and lower and lower. And now my small trees are a problem with the power lines. I'm going, oh my goodness, it's incredible.
Yeah, the comment was say she planted small trees underneath the power lines and then they kept on adding power lines. Yeah. No, that's the thing. I mean, and you can't avoid that, you know, I mean, it's just like if the power company comes and decides they want to do something out 100 feet, there's nothing you can really do about that. Yeah. You just do the best you can. That's all I'm asking. You know, you don't do something really obvious, like plant a live oak underneath, you know, something 6 feet tall, you know. Yeah. Yes.
While we all appreciate that biodiversity is very significant, we also know that the oak trees are actually a very large component of our host trees.
Yep.
For insects. So how do you recommend balancing that?
So the question was balancing diversity with oak trees and their benefit for wildlife. In absolutely no way come away from this talk thinking I'm saying don't plant oak trees. I plant oak trees all the time. Bur oak's probably my favorite tree. I love planting bur oaks. I love planting oak trees. So plant as many oak trees as you want. Again, the biggest thing I'd say is make sure you don't do it in an area that actively has trees dying of oak wilt, because you're basically wasting your time. Also, just plant a mix, basically. And I'm not saying this is kind of relative when it comes to the land areas. When we usually do a park planting, for example, it can be, you know, 3 acres to 10 acres. We'll plant 50 trees. We plant maybe 10 to 20 oaks and everything else is something else. So yeah, you want to think about what you're doing from a larger perspective rather than just squirrels like acorns, lots of things like acorns, bird like acorns, and they're important, but there's other things you could be planting as well. We planted some Carolina cherry laurel at a park about 2 months ago now. And as soon as we planted it, it was swarming with bees, mostly native bees too, not just honeybees. Clearly, they were starving for pollen. There was nothing in that area other than privet, which, but you know, there was nothing really there for them to feed on. So again, anytime you're designing a planting, try to think broad. Yeah. Is that kind of go what you're going with? Okay, cool. Any other? Yeah.
In relation to that, that most white oaks have a whole lot less tannin than the red oaks, so
Yep.
they're much more palatable to the wildlife.
Yep, that's true.
But here you got the choices, you go to a white oak.
Yep.
You're not gonna go to a red oak.
White oaks tend to be more palatable because they have less tannins.
Yeah.
That's true. Yep. Yeah. That being said, you know, red oaks still have their place for sure. So
Okay.
plant a mix. Again, I love bur oaks. I could plant whole parks full of bur oaks, but gotta mix it up a little bit. Yeah.
It's probably a stupid question. but
No
how
stupid
can you
questions.
tell us why the red oak?
All right. So this is where we were talking about at the beginning with the different oak groups. Oh, you weren't? Oh, I'm sorry.
You don't need to repeat it, it's my.
I'll talk to you in a minute then. Yep.
Okay.
We'll go over that.
I've got somebody to catch me.
Well, I have, in the early 80s, oak will cut our property and kill all of our live oaks except one.
Hmm.
And it's the one that I'm surprised, because this is the one that gets trimmed every year by
Yeah.
the power company, and it's still, it's alive, it's not well, it's misshapen because of the trimmings. So are those acorns? I mean, is it somehow immune?
So the question was,
See, we lost 50, 60
Yeah.
live oaks, huge live oaks.
yeah, the question was, you had a whole property full of live oaks and they all died except for one, which has no problem. And that was also the one that you pruned the most, right?
Yeah,
Could be resistant. Yeah, easily.
so will the acorns be
Could be.
producing, oh, okay.
I wouldn't bet on it, but
Answer it.
yeah. Do any of you know what chestnut blight is?
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's another really similar disease, and that's what they'll do. They'll try to find acorns, or not acorns in that case, chestnuts from trees that are proven to be resistant, and then try to breed those together to try to get some resistance for chestnut blight. Mixed bag on that. Chestnut blight's probably a much bigger. I don't want to say it's a bigger killer of trees, but that was a much bigger problem earlier on, back in like even the turn of the 20th century. So they've been working on that a long time. But oak wilt, there's a lot more ways to kind of prevent its spread, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
1920, 1910.
Yeah, exactly.
The chestnut lights.
Teddy Roosevelt, yeah,
Level over time.
all that, exactly, yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And any other, we'll move on through this. What time is it? Oh, it's almost 8 o'clock, all right. So, summary real quick, go back real quick, one slide. So we got oak wilt is a disease caused by a fungal pathogen. Oops, too many. All right, that's okay. The key takeaway here really is that last point I was talking about of don't prune oak trees between February 1st and June 30th. Nothing else you walk away with today. That's the important message. Okay. So we talked about oak wilt. It affects oak trees, right? Okay, so I'm from up in Michigan, went to Michigan State, and every now and then I still get bulletins from our forestry department up there. Back in February, I think it was, they sent out a bulletin on this weird case of Chinese chestnuts that ended up getting oak wilt. So they had a plantation of Chinese chestnuts that they grow for, eating chestnuts, roasting on an open fire, all that. They thought it was chestnut blight. They tested it for chestnut blight. Wasn't chestnut blight. They decided, let's just for the heck of it, see if it's oak wilt. They found the oak wilt pathogen, and they found that it's kind of hard to tell from this picture, but it did exactly what we're talking about, where maybe one tree got infected and then it just spread to all the other trees in the orchard from the root grafts. This is weird. This has only been recorded, I think, 3 times in history, okay? But it can potentially happen in other species. But 99% of, well, that was a lot of nines. 99% of the time, we're just talking about oak trees with oak wilt. But every now and then, chestnuts, again, were in that Fagaceae family. And in this case, they were impacted. I don't know if it was a mutation, what it was, but they ended up being impacted by it. A fun story. I wanted to end with that. It's kind of a question mark. All right, thank you. Any more questions? I took a little bit more time than expected.
More questions on the chat.
Perfect.
Your maps of oak wilt prevalence show gaps of infection-free areas scattered in various states. What's a possible explanation for that?
Yep. So the question was on those maps. Can we go back to the maps? Or that's probably going to be hard. The question was on the maps, there were gaps of oak wilt free areas and what accounts for that. So here we go. That's a good example. So some of this is going to be because of kind of a lack of oaks in the area, probably. So if you look at, let's see a good example. Some of it's kind of strange. For example, again, I'm from Michigan. This part of northern Michigan up in the Upper Peninsula, there's a good chunk of that that's oaks. So why that doesn't have oak wilt, but just to the south of it, it does, I don't really have a good answer for that. It's possible that they it hasn't been identified yet. Yeah, that's a good point too. So you need somebody there in order to actually see it. This is a really, I don't want to say desolate area, but there's not a lot of people up in that part of northern Michigan.
Basically an island.
Well, not really. But you can see, again, it started in Wisconsin, right? Like, as far as we know, the oldest place we've ever found it was in Wisconsin. So I would have expected it to get all the way up into that part of northern Michigan by now. It could just be that there's less people wounding trees. Maybe it's harder for the beetles to get fresh wounds. There could be lots of different reasons. I know in some of these areas, I mean, I went to Lincoln, Nebraska for a training once, and there were some oak trees in the towns, but you go past there, it's all farm fields. So if you have a lot of really interspersed oak trees, it's going to be a lot harder for the fungus, for the beetles to get there. That could be part of the reason. Out here in West Texas, I'll admit I haven't actually personally been out there yet, but from what I understand, a lot of it's really desert and arid, right? So you're probably not quite, for my purposes, no. Yeah, no.
Michigan.
From compared to Michigan, it's a lot more arid. But regardless, you're not going to have quite the same clusters of oak trees that you're necessarily going to have further east in the state. So that could be the reason. And again, it could just be nobody's identified it yet. There was, where was it? Here we go, right here, this county, that's Shiawassee County, Michigan. I worked there for a while. I know for a fact we had oak wilt there, and it never showed up on any of the maps. So it could be just the maps are incorrect. Somebody hasn't updated on whoever the powers are that be, just haven't done it yet. So Yeah, there's a lot of slides. There we go. Oh, yeah. So this is also the website for the Texas Trees Foundation. These are also some really good websites that Texas A&M has for more information on oak wilt. I very shamelessly took some of their pictures, so you'll see some repeats on there if you go on that site. Thank you. I appreciate it.